All right, hello and welcome to another HPD webinar on lead-based paint topics for building owners. This training is being presented by HPD's Office of Enforcement and Neighborhood Services, which we call OENS for short. And we are the division of HPD that employs housing inspectors and other field staff who try to inspect and maintain the quality of New York City's existing housing stock. So once again, welcome and thank you for joining us. Today's topic is going to be two-part. We're going to discuss the annual notice and investigation requirements around lead-based paint and the record requirements around lead-based paint. So there are a lot of rules under New York City's Local Law 1 of 2004 around how owners must try and prevent lead-based paint poisoning in their buildings. And one of those rules, one of these required activities, is annual notice and investigation in an attempt to determine which units have children of applicable age in them and whether those units have lead-based paint hazards. Another requirement under Local Law 1 of 2004 is that owners have to keep records of all of their lead-based paint activities, including but not limited to the annual notice and investigation. So right now we're going to learn about record keeping using the annual notice requirements as our example. So this is going to be a way of exploring both topics. So once again, welcome. My name is Phil Weitzman. I'll be your main speaker during today's training. I'm a senior trainer here within ENS. And also joining us today is Shireen Riazi Kermani. She is the Lead Compliance Officer for HPD, and she'll be jumping in to answer a few questions and make a few points during the presentation. And at the end, we've reserved about 15 minutes for question and answer, and she'll be handling the Q&A portion of this presentation. Before we get into the presentation, let's just take a quick look at how this webinar works. So one thing I want to direct your attention to is there are handouts associated with this webinar. You should see a pane, something similar to this image that you're seeing right here. And if you click on those handouts, you're going to see 5 different PDF documents that we're sharing with you. We'll be referring to most of these documents during the presentation. My advice would be, if you're at a desktop computer, go ahead and open those in case you would like to save them. They're all available on HPD's website, so it's not necessary to save them right now. But it's convenient to have them all in one place like this, so just my recommendation would be to go ahead and open them so that you can save them and possibly refer to them during the presentation. Obviously, that's going to be a little different if you're on mobile. And also for those who may be watching the recording of this webinar later on, you will not have access to the handouts, but you can still find all of these handouts at the HPD website, and we'll show you where at the end of this training. I also want to show you we have a questions or chat feature here. Feel free to share your questions with us. You can type them in at any time. We'll try to answer them during the presentation if we can, but again, we've saved 15 minutes at the end to spend just on answering your questions. And also, please do let us know if you're having any technical difficulties by typing into that questions or chat feature. After the webinar is over, a survey is going to open up on your screen. We'd be very thankful if you can take a second to fill that survey out and let us know how we're doing. We want to make sure these webinars are as helpful as possible for all of you, so please do let us know. And there's some more good news, which is that if you enjoy this presentation so much that you want to watch it twice, there will be video recording of this session. After the webinar is over, within about a day, you should receive an email with a link to that video. And folks who registered but could not attend will also get that link. And later we will put the video up on the HPD website as well. So there are options to keep coming back to this video as a resource if that's something that you'd like to do. So now let's get into a quick disclaimer. This is just where we talk about what we're trying to do with this webinar and what we are not. So this presentation is not legal advice. An important point, we're not intending this presentation to be a complete statement of building owners' responsibilities relating to lead-based paint or any other topic. Instead, what we're trying to do here is provide a general guide for how you can keep records to show that you are following the lead-based paint laws. But all owners are responsible for using their own judgment to take the principles and tools we're giving you to follow the law to the best of your ability. So we aren't able to cover absolutely everything here in this presentation. What we want to do is to provide a guide to get you oriented, to get you started, but all building owners are still responsible for complying with the law and understanding it beyond what we tell you here today. Our target audience here today is people who are somewhat familiar with the city's lead-based paint rules. So I know we have a variety of different audiences here. Some of you have told us that you're very familiar with these issues. Some of you have an okay understanding, and some people are new to these issues. If you are new to lead-based paint issues, that's okay. However, you might not be as familiar with everything we're talking about. That's okay. You can always watch along. You'll still learn a lot, and you can go back and look at some other resources to catch up on topics that you're less familiar with. And another quick note is that today we're only talking about the New York City law, Local Law 1 of 2004. There are other regulations that may apply in some cases, for instance, federal regulations. We won't be covering those right now, but we will discuss those in future webinars. Okay, so what we're going to do first is review building owners' responsibilities in New York City. So what is the law asking owners to do to prevent lead-based paint poisoning? Because all of those responsibilities are what owners must keep records of complying with. Then we're going to discuss some basic principles and tips for record keeping. And then we're going to get into how to use HPD's sample forms. HPD has released some sample forms as tools to help owners because we understand that it can be difficult to keep track of these requirements. So these sample forms are not required, but they are a useful tool, and we'll talk about how to use them both as instructions for those who choose to use the forms themselves, and in addition, as a way of reviewing all of the requirements for those who may wish to use different forms. And at the end, we'll just cover a few final notes, wrap a few things up, and then we'll move on to our Q&A section. So, moving ahead, let's take a quick poll to see where people are at. Just let us know right now, did you attend our last webinar? This is just going to give us a sense of where you guys are at so that we can make sure that we are speaking, we understand the audience we're speaking to. And so we've got our results coming in. We'll just take a few more seconds here and we can close the polls in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And it looks like most of you did not attend the previous webinar. So welcome to all of you who didn't attend, and to those of you who did attend before, welcome back. So that's good for us to keep in mind as we go ahead. So let's get into owners' responsibilities under the law. One important point that we should start with is that the way that the New York City law works, it's not a violation of the law simply to have lead-based paint in a residential apartment building. So just having lead-based paint is not the issue. The issue is when that lead-based paint becomes a hazard. So as long as lead-based paint is intact under non-lead-based paint, it's not an immediate danger. But where there's a child under the age of 6, because children are more vulnerable to lead-based paint poisoning for many reasons, and that paint is deteriorated, which will allow that child to access it, to ingest it. That's where we have a lead-based paint hazard. So the law is really focused on preventing peeling or deteriorated paint where there is a child under 6. That's what the law is talking about, and that's what all of the other provisions we're going to discuss are focused on preventing. A child under 6 and deteriorated paint. So what the law requires building owners to do is to be proactive in preventing lead-based paint hazards. What does proactive mean? It means that we don't wait until a child is poisoned before we deal with a lead-based paint hazard. Instead, we try to prevent hazards from happening before a child is poisoned. And so the law says in all multiple dwellings built before January 1st, 1960, and in addition, in multiple dwellings built between 1960 and 1978, where the owner knows there's lead-based paint in that building, building owners have to try and find out if there are children under 6 in the building and look for hazards anywhere a child could be exposed. And in addition, whenever a tenant moves out, whether or not there's a child in the unit or a child who's going to move in, owners have to do certain lead-based paint removal work in that unit. So whenever a unit turns over, there's additional work to be done. And anytime an owner is doing anything related to lead-based paint, whether it's work that disturbs that paint or just testing for the paint, the contractors have to have the right credentials. Now, the thing to understand about Local Law 1 of 2004 is that it is very detailed in how it asks owners to do these things. It gives step-by-step directions. You could say it micromanages how owners handle these issues. So you don't want to assume that just because you are making your own good faith efforts to deal with this issue, you don't want to assume that that means you're completely in compliance with the law. So we want to follow each step of the law very carefully, and we don't want to vary from what the law says. And we'll be sharing many additional resources with you during this webinar, and there are other resources available on our website and in our mailings where you can learn more about all of the detailed provisions of Local Law 1. So again, just to review the owner's responsibilities, every year an owner has to ask for children under 6, and anytime there's apartment turnover, an owner has to become interested in lead-based paint. And anytime the owner learns of any issues that could be creating a hazard in an apartment with a child, all of these, you could call them triggering events, require the owner to then go ahead and inspect for lead-based paint hazards and then hire contractors to address them. And for turnover, the requirements are a little more involved, and we'll discuss those in another webinar. We don't have time right now to get into that. But again, all of these different situations should prompt an owner to inspect for and remediate any lead-based paint hazards in their building. So a few other quick things to mention. Building owners can inspect for peeling paint themselves. The Department of Housing and Urban Development has a free online training. We can show you where to access that. There's a link at the HPD website. So any building owner can do this inspection themselves. The online training is very easy and it's free and very informative. Anytime an owner is doing this type of work, they want to use certified contractors, as we just mentioned. And the main reason why I'm repeating that is so that everyone understands that what we don't want to do is use home testing kits from hardware stores, things like that. Anytime we test for lead-based paint or do lead-based paint work, we want to do it in an approved way using certified contractors. All right, so let's talk about keeping records of all of this activity. First of all, what does the law require? The law says that building owners have to keep the records for at least 10 years. It certainly doesn't hurt to keep them longer, but the minimum required time is 10 years of lead-based paint record keeping. And the main thing to understand about record keeping is that it has to be very detailed. We are asking for records for each step of every procedure. That will make more sense when we go through our demo of the sample forms. But just generally, what you're going to see is that the city wants to see records both of what an owner did and what an owner didn't do. When an owner found lead-based paint hazards, that should be noted. When they didn't find the hazards, that should be noted. When the owner found that there's a child in the apartment, that should be noted. When they didn't find a child in the apartment, that should be noted. So we never want to think that anything is assumed. We always want to make records of every single piece of information that we collect as we enforce the lead-based paint or comply with the lead-based paint rules in our building. We recommend that you think about the fact that these records are not just for you, but for others who may need to look at them, and so keep them ready to share and in a form everyone can understand. So the way that I like to put this is that lead-based paint records are a little bit like loose change. It's not going to do you very much good if it's all hidden throughout the apartment and you have to go hunting for it when you need it. It's going to do you a lot more good if it's all collected right in a place where it's easy and you can use it right then and there. So we recommend keeping these records well organized. And when you're notating these records, be careful about using abbreviations. Consider whether anyone else outside your organization could understand the notation that you're using, because if HPD or any other entity needs to look at these records, you want to make sure that they can read what you wrote. So similarly, for those of you who may choose to keep your lead-based paint records digitally, make sure that when you hit print, that all of the information that you've entered in is all visible in the printed view. Now, let's get into the sample forms that HPD has released. So very quickly, I'm just going to show you on your screen what these forms look like. HPD recently released these forms, and in fact, as of I believe yesterday, or very recently, we've updated them slightly based on feedback we've already received. If you already started using the previous version of the forms, that's absolutely fine. But just so that you know, these forms were recently updated just to be a little bit clearer. And so this is what they look like. You can see what I mean about that detailed record keeping is required. And so we're going to give you a demonstration of how you could fill these forms out. But before we get right into that demo, we'll just talk a little bit about concepts for how to use these forms effectively. So some instructions on using the forms. If you fill these forms out thoroughly, you should be able to respond appropriately to an HPD audit. So if one of your buildings was selected for an audit of your lead-based paint record keeping, if a building owner who has been filling all of these forms out with understanding of how the forms are supposed to work will be able to respond appropriately. We want to understand that these forms are only a tool. So they are not required. They're just there for you as an option. You're free to use these forms, or you can keep the same info in any other format that you like. It's not required to use these forms, but certainly if you do use them, you'll be in very good shape for complying with the law. So in order, I mentioned this just now, in order to use these forms, we have to understand the rules that the forms are written to. So I would say that these forms are a bit like a recipe in cooking. So if I don't know anything about cooking, if I can't tell salt from sugar, then I'm not going to be successful in cooking from a recipe, even if I try to follow it step by step. Same thing with these forms. I have to understand the rules that the forms are based on, or else I'm not really going to be able to use them. I can't just pick up the forms and try and fill them out on their own without understanding what they're trying to do. And I need to be able to adapt them where necessary. So it is important to understand the underlying rules. And again, we just want to include all the necessary info. We never want to leave anything unsaid. We want to fill the forms out completely. And just a note that we will continue to update these forms based on how people tell us they're using them. So please do feel free to share your feedback with us on what you think about these forms. So before we get into the step-by-step, let's just review the requirements that these forms are written for. We're going to be focusing in on the annual inquiry process. So every year, building owners have to ask every unit in their multiple dwellings built before January 1st, 1960, whether there are children under 6 in that unit, and then where there are children, inspect for lead-based paint hazards, and then we're going to stop there for the forms that we're looking at right now. But you can see those 3 items are just part of the overall set of owners' responsibilities. Let's look a little more in a little more detail at this whole process. So the law provides some dates that different steps have to happen. So every year between January 1st and January 16th is when an owner has to ask tenants about the presence of children. The tenants have until February 15th, and then the owner has from February 16th to March 1st to do a follow-up inspection for units with children. So anyone who didn't respond, the owner is not done, the owner should go back and try and see for themselves whether there's a child at that unit. For any units where the presence of a child could not be determined, so any units that you couldn't access in your follow-up inspection, owners have to notify the Department of Health. And then once we have a list of all the units where we could confirm a child under 6, then we have to try and enter those units to inspect for lead-based paint hazards and share the results with every unit where we were able to do an inspection. So again, we ask about children under 6, we follow up where people didn't respond, we let the Department of Health know where people didn't respond, and then we inspect every unit where we know there's a child under 6, and we share the results. So we have some forms that document this process. really quick, we want to see where you guys are at. So let's go ahead and take a second. We're going to give you a poll. Have you understood our presentation so far? There are no right or wrong answers. We know this is a very detailed presentation, so we just want to make sure we aren't going too quickly for everybody. So we'll take about 10 more seconds just to give you a chance to let us know how we are doing. And we'll close the polls in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And let's take a look and see how everybody did. Okay, and most of you are following us along. Good. Good. That's good to know. And again, for those of you who are having a little trouble, we'll have some Q&A and we'll point you to additional resources at the end of the presentation as well. So let's go ahead and move forward, and we're going to get into our demonstration of the sample forms. Second here. So you're going to notice some colors as we fill out these forms. That's just to make the presentation easier. You are not required to use colors when you fill the forms out. When we do this demonstration, we're just going to give you an example of how you could use the forms. So one thing I do want to mention is that you're going to see a lot of detail here. The detail is not the point. The main point of this is to really give you a flavor of what it looks like to fill these forms out. So don't be worried if you aren't memorizing absolutely every detail that we show. We really just want to give you a sense of how the overall process works, and you'll be able to work through this on your own after this presentation. And also, it'll just give us a chance to review the annual notice requirements. One quick interlude, I do want to mention that one thing we shared with you in your handouts, and there's also available on the website, is a lead-based paint bulletin. HPD is sending these bulletins out to your property registration email address, and this one is all about the annual notice process. So if you're feeling a bit lost with the annual notice process, I recommend taking a look at this bulletin, and it's a very helpful, and it's written in a way that's pretty easy to understand on all these requirements. Last quick thing. There are a few sample forms we aren't talking about. So we're going to for the sake of time, we're not going to go over forms for apartment turnover, and there's a form where we document that we used safe work practices where paint was disturbed. So we're not going to go over those forms right now, but filling them out is very similar to filling out the forms that we are looking at. Now, we're going to be going over 5 different sample forms. You can see the forms in blue, a summary of when we asked the tenants about children under 6 when we sent our annual mailing, and a summary of anyone who did not respond when we sent that mailing out and of what we did to follow up. And then the forms in green, now we're trying to inspect for children, a summary of our attempts to inspect, a report that we share for every unit that we did inspect, and a summary of every every unit that we were not able to inspect this year. So those are our 5 forms we're going to get into, and we're going to start with the summary form for our annual tenant inquiry. So we're going to basically pretend we're doing this process and walk through the forms step by step. So you can see in red, this form is filled out with all the information I'm going to know before I do my annual inquiry. And you can see here that I've listed every unit in the building. In one case, I have a vacant apartment, and so I'm not going to be required to do annual notice for a vacant apartment because there will be no tenants there to ask me about it. And in addition, I'll be fulfilling the turnover requirements for that vacant unit. So we've got a different process. You'll also see that we have a unit here that has an HPD exemption. And so we don't have time to get into exemption now, but HPD does have an exemption process for certain units. And if a unit obtains an exemption, then as the owner of that unit, I am not going to have to do this annual notice process for that unit. So you can see I filled it out with everything I know about my units before I do the annual notice process. Now, I like to start the new year off right, so I'm going to send all of my annual notices out on New Year's Day, first thing, and you can see here that this is what I did. And I made a note that I delivered these notices by mail and that I delivered them myself. Some building owners prefer to hire a third party, an outside vendor, to handle this notice process. That's okay. And you can see we left a space here for people to indicate that that's how they prefer to handle this. And one other thing I want to notice is these forms have instructions. So if I'm wondering about some of the dates, I have a handy reference. You can see that it tells me the date I have to deliver the annual notice. And you can also see that there are instructions for attaching things. So to this form, I have to attach copies of the sample annual notices I'm sending out. If you are curious what those annual notices look like, we have an example here for you, again, in your handouts, and this is also available on the website. So this is what the annual notice looks like. So I'm going to want to attach a copy of that notice that I sent out. And just as a quick aside, take a look and see that this notice is newly revised as of this year. So this is the new notice, and the main change to this notice is that it explains that a child has to spend 10 or more hours per week in an apartment to be considered to reside in that apartment. So, so there are instructions that you're going to want to take a look at on each of these forms. Now, you'll notice there are a lot of dates on these forms. Just in case there's anybody here watching this webinar who is sitting there realizing that they did not do this process yet, we do want to let you know that so the dates are important, but what's more important is attempting to comply with the law. If HPD was to take a look at your building, they're going to make a note, you know, if you do this process 2 weeks later, it's not the best situation, but what HPD is really concerned with is people who are not doing these requirements at all or who are doing the underlying steps improperly. So please do go ahead and stay in compliance. It's not the absolute end of the world if you send this notice out on January 16th or even today. Better late than never, so go ahead and deal with this process even if if you were not able to follow all of the deadlines. Now, you can see the information in green. This is now my recording of the responses I received. So you can see some tenants did respond, some did not. Some told me there was a child under 6 in their unit, some said there wasn't, and I note how they responded. We have here a verbal response in the bottom right of your screen. You can see, so let's just say in this case, the tenant stopped by the management office to deliver their rent check, and at that time I asked them about a child, and so they never responded to my notice, but they still let me know, so that's why I'll write verbal response. And I might want to take a note of exactly what they said and when, just, you know, as an additional layer of record, but there's room for me to explain the different ways that the tenant told me what was happening. So now we can see that this form still isn't done, because those tenants who did not respond, or those units that did not respond, we are missing all of the information highlighted in yellow. And so for those units, every unit that's highlighted here, we're going to have to go take other steps to see, is there a child in that apartment? So now we're going to move to another form. This is where we document how we followed up to find out about children in those units. So in this form, I've entered every unit that was highlighted, that we highlighted previously. These are all of the units that did not respond when I sent the inquiry. And now, I'm going to make a note of whatever I know about this unit already. So even though some units did not respond to my inquiry, I may still have knowledge. You can see in this instance, most of the units I don't know whether there's a child, but for this unit 1B here, I happen to know there's a child. Let's say that this tenant complained to me about noise. They sent a letter to my office and they said that they have an infant child who's having trouble sleep because of the noise. The point is that I know there's a child in this apartment even though the tenant never responded, so I don't have to do a follow-up inspection for that unit. I just know that there's a child already. So for every other unit, I'm going to have to do a follow-up inspection to see if there is a child. And now you can see in the light blue, here are all the inspections that I and my employees did. Luckily, you can see on the left, we were able to access every unit, 3 of the units rather, on February 16th. And so we were able to access, and each of these units, you can see in this field here, did have a child under 6. Now, one unit I made several attempts to access, but I was never able to access that unit, so I don't have any results for that unit. And note the word attempts. So we have to make multiple attempts to see if there's a child in the unit. By the way, one other quick thing I'll mention is that many of you will probably find it convenient if you are able to access these apartments to see if there's a child, you'll probably want to go ahead and do your inspection for lead-based paint hazards right then and there. So you could go ahead and get that process started. These forms are all written to track closely with how the law divides the process, and the law makes a distinction between inspecting for a child versus inspecting for the actual hazards. So we're doing this demo based sort of on how the law is structured, but of course, once you access this apartment, you're probably going to want to check for lead hazards right then, and that's totally okay. But we're sort of breaking out the different parts of the process for the purpose of this demo. Now that I'm done with my inspections for a child, I have to tell the Department of Health about any units where I was not able to determine if there was a child. This is a specific provision of the law, so I have to send them a letter, and I'm going to make a note of when I did that. And again, be sure to take a look at the instructions on the forms. For instance, in this case, the instructions are telling me that I'm going to need to send proof that I mailed that notice to the Department of Health and Mental Hygiene. All right, so now, the one other thing we have to do relating to the apartment that we could not access is add it to our list, our yearly list of every apartment where we could not do the inspection. So we have a list, we're making two different notes of this particular unit, and so we're going to have a list every year of every apartment we couldn't inspect, so we'll add the same information into this list. We're getting that list started now. Let's go back and take a look at our summary. Now we are able to fill the summary out completely. So all of this information in yellow that before was empty, now we are able to enter that. And so you can see that for these we put owner inspection as the basis of our information about whether there's a child in each unit. And for the unit that we could not access, I just added a little note that said access refused. So that's just a small example of how I adapted these forms, as you will want to do as well if you're using them. You know, there wasn't a field to say access refused, but I just made a quick little note, and that's totally fine, just like I did for vacant apartment. So now, we're able to identify every unit where we know there's a child under 6. So now I've highlighted those units. This is every unit where I know that there's a child. Every place I put yes on this form, I've made a list of those units now. And now I'm going to use those units to start my summary form of all the inspections I have to do, because I have to at least attempt to inspect every single one of those units where I know that there is a child. And so I've gone ahead and put those into this form. I sent a request to every occupant on March 1st, letting them know I need to inspect your unit to keep your children safe from lead-based paint hazards, and this is because I need to do my annual inspection. By the way, you'll notice that I can also note occupant complaint. So this tracks back with the fact that once I do my annual notice and inspection, I'm not done keeping my tenants safe from lead-based paint hazards. Anytime I learn about a leak, a 311 complaint, an HPD violation, structural damage to the building, anything that could cause a lead-based paint hazard in a unit with a child under 6, I have to follow up and do the same process of inspecting for hazards and then hiring certified contractors to remediate them. So this form you could adapt fairly easily to reflect those requirements, and you can use this field to get started there. So I have every unit with a child under 6, and my super, Jane Doe, attempted to inspect every unit. And you can see she was able to inspect every unit but one here. And we did the inspections ourselves. We didn't hire a third party. And I just adapted the form a bit. I added the date of the inspection next to the name of my super who did that. And I noted, did I find lead-based paint hazards or did I not? Now, for the one unit where I was not able to complete the inspection, I just put a line through the rest of the results because I'm not able to complete that part. So let's take a look now at the apartment that we could not access. So we need to make some additional notes regarding that apartment, and we're going to go again. We already got this form started before, to our form that summarizes where we could not complete our annual inspection. So we just add that apartment. In both cases, you can see that the occupant refused access. I just put C notes. Just my personal style. If the tenant refused access for me to make this inspection, I would probably just make a few notes of what they said and why, just in case I had to refer to those later. So now this form is complete. We have a complete list of every unit that we were not able to complete the annual inspection for this year. There are only 2 apartments on this sample form that we're using for demo purposes. Depending upon your building and your tenants, and your ability to access the units, you may have many more units than just 2. This is just for the sake of an example here. So hopefully you will have no units on here. Hopefully you'll be able to do all the required inspections, but there's no right number here. It's just based on, are you able to access that unit? So now let's go back to our summary and let's highlight what we have to do. We already dealt with units we couldn't access. Now what about the units that with a child under 6 that we could access to check for lead-based paint hazards? Let's take a look at what we have to do for those. So we're just going to highlight just one, which is apartment 3A here. And we're now going to fill out our apartment report. So this is the report of everything we found once we got into that apartment. And so we'll just take a quick look here. Oops, I'm just going to go back 1 second. Sorry about that. I'm listing all the rooms that I inspected. Because I found a lot of different issues in the living room, I found it easier to mention the living room a few times. You can make those own kinds of decisions for yourself. And what you'll see here is that this form asks a lot of very specific questions about peeling paint, teeth marks on a chewable surface, deteriorated subsurface, friction surfaces. And that makes this form a very valuable tool because these questions are formulated in a way that's going to make it much simpler for you to determine which work practices are required for all these hazards that your staff have identified or that you have identified. And you notice I just adapted the form. I found it easier to read by writing yes or no under the columns that said yes or no. Obviously, that's up to you. Just another example of how you customize these. And I just made a note of where I found the hazards in each room. Baseboard at south wall, ceiling, etc. Any notation that's reasonably clear is fine. In this case, I had a ceiling that leaked, and very important, I still entered results for the kitchen and the bathroom, even though I didn't find any hazards. So I just wrote no under all of these columns and wrote not applicable under my notes. That's because, again, I want to show that I did the inspection. Even if I didn't find anything, I want to keep records of the fact that I performed my responsibilities under the law. So now that we've completed all our apartment reports, showing what we found when we did inspect, we're able to finish the last bit of our form, which is to note how we shared the results with our tenants. So we are required to share the results of these inspections with the tenants. And so in this case, we sent those results to each tenant on March 20th, 2019. We made a note that they were delivered. Again, you're going to want to check the instructions to see what proof you may have to attach, in case you want to be sure to be attaching all of these forms. And again, these forms we're talking about are the apartment report that we had just looked at previously that listed every room in the apartment and listed the hazards that were found. All right, we're done with our walkthrough of the forms. Hopefully, you're still with us. So now we're just going to take a moment to cover just a few things that we want to cover that are just some extra little topics here. So we mentioned this previously. Some building owners like to hire outside companies to handle their annual notice process, and that is completely fine. That's allowed, and that can be a great way to take care of your needs with this responsibility. We just do want to mention be sure that you are using a responsible vendor, because under the law, owners are still ultimately responsible for complying with provisions of this law. And also, from what we understand, generally these companies will handle the mailing process, but they're not necessarily going to do all of these follow-up inspections, all of the turnover requirements, a lot of the other requirements of the law, these companies may not do. So be sure that you understand what your vendor is and is not completing for you. Don't assume that because you've hired one of these vendors that your responsibilities are completely taken care of. Also want to mention that HPD has released a number of sample forms that you can find on the website. They're the ones we just went over, and others relating to turnover and to documenting that safe work practices were used whenever construction work disturbed lead-based paint. But there are a few other responsibilities that we don't have specific forms for. One of those is the inquiry anytime a lease is signed. Most of you are probably familiar with this, but I'll show this document just so we have a visual reference. So as most of us know, the tenant has to be provided with this form and anytime a lease is signed. So we want to make sure to be documenting that we're complying with that requirement. We can make our own records to do that. And similarly, we can usually adapt one of the forms I just showed you. I already mentioned this, but aside from the annual notice process, you want to make sure you're documenting that you're following up whenever you learn of possible lead-based paint hazards in a unit with a child under 6, whether that's, again, a leak, some other damage to the building, a complaint by the tenant about the condition to you, a 311 complaint, an HPD violation. An owner should be responding to these things year-round and keeping records of that. And again, you can adapt the sample forms that we showed you to kind of keep track of these responsibilities, or you can make your own forms if that's what's easier for you. Now, the question that's probably on some of your minds right now: what if you're attending this webinar now and only now realizing that you do not have the 10 years of records required by law? So it's not a great situation, but we'll tell you what to expect. So first of all, go ahead and collect whatever records you do have relating to lead-based paint work in your building. You probably have a lot of invoices, repair records, correspondence with tenants. You probably have a lot of records that just aren't organized in the way that HPD has asked for, but just go ahead and collect whatever you have. Now, HPD is beginning to audit buildings to see if they are in compliance with these record-keeping requirements. So if HPD was to select my building for an audit, and I'm a building owner without all the records, I'll receive a violation. However, it's important to understand that these violations work like any HPD violation. So anytime HPD issues a violation, there's a certification process where the owner has the opportunity to demonstrate that they've corrected the issue going forward. HPD understands that you aren't going to be able to produce, records from years ago that simply don't exist. So in this case, the remedy is going to be showing that you're keeping the records properly going forward in the future. So you'll still have a chance to respond, and HPD will work with you to respond to those violations when they are issued. And of course, it's worth mentioning that to avoid this issue, be aware that this is something that you should ask for when purchasing a building. So be sure to ask the previous owner for all of their lead-based paint records, and there is a process where if the owner does not have those records, there's an affidavit that you will be able to fill out, but much easier to ask ahead of time for all of those records when purchasing a building. Now, as we wrap up the presentation, I just want to mention that there are many, many more resources. We've shown you several of them, and now I just want to go to the website to show where you can find them. So if you go to nyc.gov/HPD, which is this website right here, I'll enter the address again so you can follow along. So we're going to the HPD website, and we're going to click on Services and Information. And we're going to go to Housing Quality Safety, and we're going to scroll down to lead-based paint. And there are a lot of resources here. Building owners are going to want to scroll down the page a bit past tenant information, and to owner responsibilities, where you can find more detail about the annual requirements. Looks like our screen is taking a second to catch up, but there you can see. And I want to show you under record keeping and compliance forms, you can find all of the sample forms that we just showed you, as well as many other useful affidavits and forms that may come in handy. And if I scroll down to additional resources and open that, there are a lot of other helpful tools. Two things I want to highlight again are owner bulletins. Everyone who's attending this webinar should have received these because we know you've all provided your email with your property registration. These are very, very useful. They have all of the latest news about lead-based paint and HPD. So take a bit to read these if you have questions about the topics that they cover. They're very, very helpful. And you also can find the recording of our past webinar, which is more of an introduction to these issues for those of you who are just getting started with lead-based paint and maybe feeling a little lost. That is a great introduction, our last webinar, which we provided in December, and we'll continue uploading the videos of these webinars to this page as well. And of course, as I mentioned, you will also receive a follow-up email with a link to the video within about a day after we wrap this webinar up. If you do have questions about specific situations relating to your specific building, by the way, we have the phone number here for HPD's lead-based paint unit, 212-863-5501. So if you do have questions about, a specific violation issued to your building, that's going to be the number to call. But now let's move on and let's have some time to take your questions. Oh, and before we get to that, I do want to mention to ask you to please take our survey at the end. Let us know how you felt about this webinar and on other topics that you'd like to see us cover. So, it is my pleasure to introduce again Shireen Riazi-Kermani. She is the Lead Compliance Officer for HPD's Office of Enforcement and Neighborhood Services. She is deeply involved in setting HPD's lead-based paint policy. She's a great resource, and she's going to start answering your questions that you've been submitting. Feel free to send more questions in as we do the Q&A as well.
Thanks so much, Phil. And I know Phil went over a lot of information here in a short amount of time, and we do appreciate your questions that have been coming in. We're getting some repeats on some of these questions, so we'll definitely be addressing these. And I do want to mention, though, that we are getting some that are off topic, and so we aren't going to be addressing those at this time since we are limited in the amount of time we have for questions. What I mean by off topic in that they are specific to turnover requirements or specific to the exemption process. And I would encourage you to go to the website because there is more detailed information. There's our exemption application with detailed instructions on there. There's detailed information about turnover. And check out the website, check out the lead bulletins that Phil mentioned and showed on the website as well that can provide you some more information since we won't be specifically answering those questions here. But I want to go ahead and get into the topics here at hand, into the questions. And we do have a question, actually two, from two of our attendees, Shunmei and Reno. If I'm mispronouncing those names, I do apologize for those names and any name I mention going forward. But those two attendees are asking specifically about if they already know from previous knowledge, knowing their tenants, do they have a small building, they know that there's no child living in the unit, do they have to go through this process with the annual notice? Short answer is yes. And some background on that. Number one, the law does prescribe that the annual notice is a requirement for all pre-1960, built before 1960 buildings. So you are documenting that you have then done the requirement under law, and you are identifying then specifically using that prescribed process that there is no child specifically from your tenant's information on that notice. And then also, as Phil did mention, that there has been recently a change to how the term resides is defined. So previously, it was basically understood that reside means that the child lives there. So you might know that there is no child that lives in your building, but since the law has changed now and the definition of the term resides actually means if they spend 10 or more hours routinely per week. So they could be babysitting another child, a family member, and that child is there 10 hours per week, and maybe you weren't aware of that. So yes, you do have to do the annual notice and identify whether or not there is a child there.
And just to add to that, just to call back, remember when I mentioned earlier in the webinar that the law is very detailed and step-by-step, and the law requires us to say how we know things and to prove that we asked in the required way. So even if you know or you think you know that there are no 6-year children, as far as the law is concerned, you just aren't done until you follow those steps.
Yes, that's a good way of summarizing it. So yes, do the notices and make sure you have on record what your tenant has responded with. And let's see here. Another question that we can answer, and we're getting a couple on these. It was Kent and Robert, I believe, two of our attendees that asked about two-family residences. So it was mentioned earlier that one of the things that we were going over here was in relation to multiple dwellings. So they're asking about whether or not the law applies to if it's 2 units, a rental unit with only 2 units, not 3 or more units. And here's the easiest way to answer that. Local Law 1 of 2004, which is what we are reviewing here today, the turnover requirement has always applied since 2004 to what we call a private dwelling. A private dwelling is a rental unit where it's only 1 or 2 units in the building. So that turnover requirement and those turnover records have always applied to those private dwellings. And there is a lot of movement at the local level on law changes. There is actually a council bill that I believe was just passed, voted on and passed last week that will put into effect in the future. I think it takes about a year for that specific bill to go into effect, that will expand all of the provisions of Local Law 1, so in other words, the annual notice and the annual investigation, to those private dwellings where the owner does not reside or an immediate family member does not reside in the unit. So there's a two-part to that question in that, yes, turnover has always applied, and so you do need to be doing that in those private dwellings, 1 to 2 unit dwellings, and also keep your eye on these changes, and there'll be forthcoming communication from HPD to those owners to make sure they're aware of these changes that are happening to the law. So you that are attending this webinar are maybe getting a heads up before the rest of the folks out there. And let's see here. Another question from Sarah is, what if the unit was gut renovated 3 years ago? Do we need to test for lead-based paint? And she's actually specifically asking about turnover, but I am going to answer this question just in general because you're talking about a gut renovation and you're trying to establish that there is no lead-based paint there. So here's how I would answer that question. And again, this is not legal guidance, but here's how I would answer that question. What records do you have? Do you have records that demonstrate that every single wall was torn down, all components were completely replaced, windows were completely replaced, all doors were? Is that what you're able to demonstrate? And so you're able to show that there would be no lead-based paint in that unit. If I was in your position, I would actually be hiring a contractor to come in and test that unit, because if I didn't have records to demonstrate that there specifically is no lead-based paint, that might be difficult then to prove. Because you could have records that show, okay, I replaced these components, but I don't have records that show that everything was done. Just to be safe, let's go ahead and do that testing. And what I would also encourage you to do, Sarah, is to follow through on the exemption that HPD offers. Because if you are able to demonstrate that there is no lead-based paint, and you are able to then apply for an exemption from HPD and be issued that exemption, then you have that record from HPD to hold on to and know that these requirements under Local Law 1 do not apply to you. So I would go on the avenue of, playing it safe, making sure that you are testing to demonstrate that there is no lead-based paint after your gut renovation, and then seeking that exemption from HPD. And let's see here. We do have a question here asking about the requirements for any number of apartments in the building. And I just want to, clarify on that. If you were trying to distinguish between a private dwelling where it's 1 to 2 units or a multiple dwelling where it's 3 or more units, hopefully I did answer that and make it a little bit more clear earlier, in that there are specific turnover requirements required if there's only 1 to 2 units in the building, versus if it's 3 or more units, then everything that we went over here today does apply now. And let's see here for an additional question that we have. Someone was asking whether or not these forms are only for the 5 boroughs. I think that was Alexandra. So this is, what we went over here is specific to New York City. So I'm not sure if that is what you meant there, but what we're going over here is specific to Local Law 1 of 2004, which is a New York City administrative code and local law.
And just to mention, so these specific rules apply in New York City, but if you manage properties outside of New York City, your jurisdiction likely has similar rules. So you'll have to contact the different city agencies or county agencies in those other jurisdictions to see what they require. But what we're discussing is all New York City law. And I do want to mention there are different questions around these requirements and whether they apply to private dwellings. Another thing to keep in mind is that we're talking about the record keeping and other very specific requirements under Local Law 1, but it is just generally required for building owners to prevent their children in their units from being subject to lead-based paint hazards. So even if some of these record keeping requirements don't take the same form, every owner, you should be sure that you are trying to keep your tenants informed about the dangers of lead-based paint to prevent children from being poisoned. So for instance, right now in a private dwelling, if a child became lead poisoned, the Department of Health is still going to respond and issue a commissioner's order to abate. So there are other possible consequences. So every owner is responsible for preventing their tenants from dealing with these issues, regardless of the specific requirements. So we know it's a lot to keep track of, but you just want to keep that in mind. Even if the specific requirements don't always apply in the same way with all the same details, the basic point is always the same. All owners have to prevent this issue in their buildings.
Okay, and we're getting a bunch of questions, so we'll just have to see what we have time for, because we are brushing up against our time limit here. So let me start to go through and see what we can answer here quickly. Reno asked if this includes hallways that are painted. Quick answer to that, not sure exactly what you were referring to there, but what we call those are common areas, and those are mentioned in Local Law 1, and an owner who identifies that there is a child under 6 who resides in a unit in the building is required then to also, in addition to checking that individual unit where that child resides for the lead-based paint hazards, is also required to look at those common areas, look at those hallways, the lobby, the stairwell perhaps, that are painted, and identify if there are lead-based paint hazards there. So I hope that answers your question there, Reno. Someone asked here, Tiana asked about can the notices for the annual inspections be hand-delivered? That was indicated on the form, so go back and take a look at that form, Tiana, that it did give you the option for mailing, hand delivery, or emailing the annual notice.
And Shireen, we saw a question, can they be emailed?
Yes, so there was, I think, on the form there, if we can pull that up, actually we don't need to pull that up, but I'm just looking at it here. And it does have the method of delivery and identifies email, mail, and hand delivery. So you do have some options there to send it out, but then also make sure you keep for your records then, if you're dealing with an email, make sure you keep for your records something that shows that you did email it out, because we would be looking for that as a part of our records request to you. And let's see here. Alexandra was mentioning, what if I did not complete this for 2019? Phil mentioned this earlier. So if you're just sitting there right now and saying, oh shoot, I didn't get the annual notice done and it was supposed to have been done by January 16th, well, go out and do it now. Go ahead and pull up the annual notice that's required to be delivered and document that you are getting it out to your tenants and ask for it back from them by February 15th. Again, we're trying to be more flexible on the timelines here. It's most important that you go out and do the activity, because then you have identified where there's a child in the unit, and you can do then the follow-on activity, which would be the inspection for the lead-based paint hazards.
We're seeing a few questions about where to send these forms or where to mail them in. So just to be clear, you are not required to send the record-keeping forms that we just went over anywhere. So you are required to keep the records. You'll only need to produce those forms to HPD in the event of an audit. And, obviously the forms may come up, for instance, in the case of civil litigation around lead-based paint issues or in other situations like that. But the requirement is not that every owner has to share the forms with HPD. It's simply that you have to keep them. So if you're wondering where to send them, you don't have to send them anywhere. You just have to keep them and maintain them in a safe, organized fashion in case they are requested. So the one thing that you do have to mail is that notice to the Department of Health about units where you were not able to confirm the presence of a child because that unit did not respond to your annual inquiry. So there's a specific piece of the law that requires you to mail only that result to the Department of Health.
I'm just going to answer, hopefully here, one more question. Candace was asking if dust wipes were previously done in the apartment and came back negative, do inspections have to be conducted? Now, some of the folks listening might know what dust wipes are and some might not. But a dust wipe is actually done to demonstrate that post-work being done in a unit, that it is okay for the tenant to reoccupy that unit. What it's demonstrating is that there is no more residual lead dust in the unit. But Candace, what it does not demonstrate is that there is, it's not lead-based paint in the unit. So this is looking at the presumption that there is lead-based paint in that unit if it was built prior to 1960. So again, I would encourage, if you are trying to avoid everything that we are looking at here, that we are presenting to you, that you should be looking to test the unit. And if you think that there is no lead-based paint there, test the unit and apply for an exemption, because that exemption issued by HPD is what puts you in a place where you don't have to do a lot of these follow-on activities.
One other thing, one last question to answer. We received some questions from Kyle about where to find some of the resources that we just went over, and I know we went over the website fairly quickly. So let's go ahead and find the visual assessment training here on the website. So to find any of these resources, you're going to go to owner responsibilities, and I believe the visual assessment training is under annual responsibilities, and here it is, it's item number 2, online visual assessment training. I'll click the link so you can see what it looks like. So here it is, and it's a quick, helpful training that you can find linked on the website by, again, navigate your way to the lead-based paint page. Oh, I'm seeing that some of you may not have seen this. Okay, so I've clicked the link, but you're experiencing a bit of delay there. So as we wait for that page to load, just to follow up, you can find everything we mentioned on the website, almost all of it under this little owner responsibilities area. So thank you for that follow-up question. And the webinars are also there. We've received a question, again, about where to watch the previous webinar. Okay, so I think that's about all the time we have. Thanks to all of you for your time and attention during this webinar. We hope that you found it helpful. And again, please take a second to fill out the survey. And we are about to sign off. Have a wonderful day, everybody.